Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 121 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is the podcast where I discuss current events related to foreign policy and international news and then give some analysis on those events. The show can be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or at thelibertarianinstitute.org, and it's on the homepage. So for today's show, I thought I'd do something that was a little bit different and I think kind of interesting. And that is I'm going to kind of give you a Thanksgiving Day preparation episode. So for all of you who will have, uncles or relatives or whoever talking politics at, the family dinner and you want to be, kind of prepared and ready for the foreign policy stuff, I'm going to kind of run down what's going on in the conflicts to give you guys plenty of knowledge and information. I'm going to try to really just highlight the important points, debunk some of the, I think, more common myths. Hopefully I hit the ones that are going to be brought up. It's so hard to tell. There's so many ridiculous lies when it comes to the foreign policy stuff. And it's from it's from the neoconservatives, it's from the left, it's from the social, everybody's got ridiculous lines on foreign policy. And so there's so many lies to debunk. And so the first place I'm going to start is I think probably one of the more dynamic places right now, and one where we're going to see a lot of developments over Thanksgiving and the weekend coming up here, and that is in Iraq and Syria. For a long time, especially in Syria, there's been kind of this notion that everybody's just going to attack ISIS, and that's the way we're going to not have conflict between the United States SDF faction versus the Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, Russia half of the war. However, in both Iraq and Syria, ISIS no longer holds any urban population centers. I think they probably control some villages in the desert. But ISIS has pretty much been declared to be defeated both by Assad in Syria and by the U.S. coalition in Iraq. So this kind of, I think, is an opportunity for everybody to bring this up. Say, hey, look, ISIS just got defeated. The caliphate is gone. Baghdadi is now no more than Osama bin Laden was after 9/11 and is probably in hiding somewhere, and one day he'll meet his end when a US commando shoots him in the face. But as far as ISIS actually being a place, that's not a thing anymore. Now they're just a terror network like Al-Qaeda, which they originally broke off from. Now, you might have to, give the caveat to people, sure, the Islamic State is going to seize a village here and a village there in Syria and in Iraq as well as other places, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, even East Asia. However, the actual threat, of an Islamic caliphate, from Raqqa to Mosul is completely gone and not something anybody needs to worry about anymore. And so the question is, the hell is the U.S. still doing in Iraq and Syria? And this is something I think you could bring up to just about anybody. This was the kind of the thing that Trump ran on. So if you're talking to a Trump supporter, say, hey, look, Trump ran on the idea that we are going to knock the hell out of ISIS and go the hell home. And, we knocked the hell out of ISIS, so time to go home. And on the left, bring up that with ISIS gone, what credible threat is the United States fighting in the Middle East? Now, we've had Mattis and others tell us that, the U.S. is going to stay to make sure no enemy, ever pops up. The U.S. coalition, was posting on Twitter yesterday that, hey, look, the U.S. is training up these Iraqi troops. I think retweeted with the quote something about, well, who the hell are they shooting at? Because you just said ISIS was defeated in Iraq. And kind of the idea is, why is the U.S. training the Iraqi army if there's not a legitimate threat to the United States in Iraq? And not that ISIS ever was that legitimate threat, but, if you're at Thanksgiving dinner, don't get into that little argument. Just go from where we're at now is that ISIS is defeated, so why are we still training Iraqi troops? Now I'm guessing what they're going to say is, well, you never know what's going to happen the last time we pulled out. And so say then, does that mean U.S. troops have to remain in Iraq and Syria forever? Are we now saying that Americans have to stay in this portion of the world until the end of time to make sure our Americans are safe? That doesn't seem like really a sustainable policy to have. And then, especially, I think for anyone, just focus on the financial stuff, especially when it comes to military spending. Even the left isn't a big fan of that. Talk about all the welfare programs we could fund with the money if that's what they want to hear. But, even if they're okay with some Americans dying in the Middle East every year, I'm sure they're now okay with spending billions of dollars in Iraq and Syria. Also, just the potential problems down the road. This sets up a potential conflict with Russia. Talk about how this could improve U.S.-Russian relations. We're able to work out the ceasefire deal that helps end the Syrian civil war. That's a really great thing. However, if Assad is intent on taking all of Syria, is the United States willing to fight Russia to protect the Syrian Kurds? It seems unlikely, and something that we probably shouldn't be doing. Next, Afghanistan. So for those of you, I guess just kind of the factual update is the United States now admits to having about 14,000 troops in Afghanistan. Although earlier, maybe a week or two ago, we had the United States kind of saying that we're going to have about 16,000 troops in Iraq by the end of the year. The Trump administration has said that they're deliberately not, going to be very accurate with these numbers and not going to have any timetables or anything like that. And so this is a good talking point for us, just pointing out, hey, look, the Trump administration is admitting that this war is indefinite. It's never going to end. I think a good thing to point out is that the Taliban surrendered in, I believe, 2001, right? So we're talking about 16 years ago, the Taliban waved the white flag and said, the Americans won. The problem is that the Taliban are now kind of fighting as an insurgency. And so while they're, I guess, willing to probably stay out of Kabul, they're not going to accept a U.S. ruler over their whole territory, and they're not going to, accept continuous U.S. presidents in Afghanistan forever. So I think we can make a really strong point here that, hey, this is a stupid war. There's really no reason to be here. I think if you try to, talk about the geopolitical implications of the specific Trump policy to bring closer ties between India and Afghanistan, which interestingly enough right now is being facilitated by Iran, allowing the Indians to use Iranian ports to bring food to Afghanistan. It is probably going to be too complicated to talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. So I would really just highlight, what is the U.S. doing there? You could talk about the opioid thing in Afghanistan. This seems to be something that kind of piques people's interest. The U.S. just announced that Afghanistan had another record crop, both in amount of acre used to produce opiate and the amount of opiate produced and heroin produced in Afghanistan in 2017. That crop is being used by the Taliban to fund their insurgency against the United States. They're able to field about a 25,000 man army with $90 million, and that is easily covered by what they make in the opium trade. So this means come spring of 2018, when the spring offensive by the Taliban takes place, we're looking at another, full-out war between the United States troops and the Taliban. The United States continues to move their troops closer and closer to the front lines, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq and Syria, and this is going to put them more in danger. This is a good place to talk about. There's more Americans dying in the Middle East now than there was in the past 2 years. I think this is pretty significant. One of the things I felt like Trump was elected on was that, no more U.S. citizens dying in the Middle East. And if, not a Trump fan, if you just look at it, why would U.S. troops be dying for a cause that Donald Trump supports? That's ridiculous. You may have to do some debunking against, one day Al-Qaeda will come back. I think I would bring up the point that, the Taliban hold more territory in Afghanistan now and more than now than any time since 2001. That seems pretty significant. That the United States has done everything they could in Afghanistan up until now, and they still can't control the country. Then it means that kind of the option is not to provoke people into, carrying out blowback. Also mentioned that the hijackers and the people who planned and plotted 9/11 weren't Afghanis. They were Saudis and Egyptians and Arabs that were only in Afghanistan because that was kind of the furthest reaches of the planet, places on the planet to go. And, as Scott Horton had explained on this show, the Taliban were willing to give up bin Laden and kind of hint to the United States, hey, assassinate this guy if you want to. And the U.S., didn't take their opportunity when they had it. There also is the issue of ISIS being in Afghanistan. This isn't necessarily ISIS like the, Middle East ISIS. These guys are Tariqi Taliban from Pakistan who are fleeing the U.S. drone war and the Pakistani efforts against them in Pakistan. They kind of got chased into Afghanistan from there. These guys aren't kind of the same kind of ISIS fighters, and really, are kind of a consequence of what's going on with the U.S. war, that we're just chasing jihadists around the Middle East now, spreading them everywhere. Yemen is something that may be a little hard to talk about just because it's so depressing. It's, it's not going to be easy as, you're breaking the wishbone to say, to your cousin, hey, the U.S. is starving 1 million people to death in Yemen. But if the thing comes up, know that the Houthis are not tied to Iran. This is always portrayed as a proxy war, and it's absolutely not. The Iranians did not give the Houthis the missiles they fired at Saudi Arabia. Those missiles were Yemeni-designed Scud missiles upgraded. The Scud missiles, I think, were actually from the North Koreans way back when, so kind of Cold War Soviet-era type weapons. And, in fact, the Iranians have tried to give the Houthis advice, and they haven't taken it whatsoever, so, don't let anybody kind of say that this is a proxy war. This is a war by Saudi Arabia against the people of Yemen. I think this is a good time. You could just say this is mostly the young prime minister there trying to pick on some Shia population from the north of Yemen and trying to look all successful and brilliant and wage a war, and it's absolutely blown up in his face. Talk about the U.S. role in the war in Yemen. We're providing diplomatic cover to the blockade. If any other country in the world was blockading a country and causing 7 million people to starve to death, Nikki Haley would be on the floor of the UN crying every day about how, evil the Russians or the Chinese were or whoever else was doing it. But because it's the Saudis, the U.S. says nothing. The U.S. is also providing mid-air refueling, bombs, intelligence, everything else that makes the Saudi war in Yemen possible. The war could not happen without the United States. You could talk about why this war is being fought. A 2015 article published in the New York Times quotes U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, who was giving them this statement. This wasn't like some secret audio recording where she says the United States is going to support Saudi's war in Yemen only to placate the Saudis because they were upset about the Iran nuclear deal. And at that time, they knew it was an endless war. And so, these are all, I think, really good talking points for the Yemen situation. We have the cholera. It's going to affect 1 million people by the end of the year. Like I said, 7 million people starving to death. The Saudi blockade of Yemen is now pretty much an absolute blockade. There's aid that's sitting offshore in Yemen, food that's going bad, medicine that's expiring, fuel that's, just sitting there as the generators in Yemen are turned off and people no longer have access to clean water, power, and medicine that goes bad because it's unable to be refrigerated. And so, it's a real tragedy in Yemen. So, if the opportunity comes up, talk to people about Yemen, because this is something where, like I said, the war is only being fought to placate the Saudis over the Iran nuclear deal, something that Trump doesn't even support. I don't think there's a whole lot of political support in the United States behind the war in Yemen. So if we could, start to, ignite some fires on this issue, that, maybe we can make some progress on it. With North Korea, the big new news is that the United States is labeling North Korea a state sponsor of terror. I think from the position of the Trump administration, this is pretty much just empty rhetoric. North Korea isn't helping Al-Qaeda. That's completely ridiculous. What North Korea is doing is they're using all their money to build a nuclear weapons program, which is a hell of a lot more effective as an anti-American deterrent as, arming up the, Houthis ever could be, or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, or whoever the United States wants to label as terrorist. So, this is a good way maybe talk about how Trump's North Korea policy is like a Bush-era policy, and the Bush-era policy on North Korea only led to North Korea having nuclear bombs when they didn't at the start of it. Overall, I think the worst part about the North Korea thing and the biggest narrative that you could debunk is the idea that Kim Jong-un is a nut job. Say, hey, look, this is a guy who was made ruler of the country at a very young age in a very desperate situation. The Soviet Union, communist China, all of these, all the other communist countries have really, been accepted into the international community now. And it's really just North Korea and, maybe you want to consider the Cubans, although they've gone some pretty heavy reforms, as being the isolated communist states. And they've only managed to do this through very careful diplomatic moves, and not to glorify the regime or anything like that, but just to say, hey, look, this, guy is somewhat intelligent, and while he may be a brutal monster in, putting the people in his country through horrible situations, he's not going to commit suicide and fire a nuclear weapon first. The Zimbabwe thing might come up. I don't think there's a whole lot of political take to be had on it because, like I said in the last podcast, there's almost an eerie omission in the media of any popular support for Mugabe within Zimbabwe. I think you could talk this up as something that, so far this is peaceful, so that's a good thing. So this is maybe a positive foreign policy story to talk about. Mugabe wasn't a good guy. The country of Zimbabwe became a worse place, after. Some people are warning that Zimbabwe may turn back into a, racist state controlled by white people. I don't really see that. It looks like the, political power party that Mugabe was a part of is more than willing to take the former vice president and make him the current president of Zimbabwe. So it's not like we're getting a radical change here. The former vice president was the longtime vice president of Zimbabwe and was, a revolutionary with Mugabe when he, gained power in the country a long time ago. I think the fear going forward that I have with Zimbabwe, if somebody wants to talk about, what's going on in the future, is that there could be war breaking out as different factions vie for power. But it does look like the international community, especially the countries around South Africa, are all really looking to help to have a peaceful transition of power. Saudi Arabia, this is a really interesting story that I'm sure people, if they think a lot about foreign policy, will be asking about. And if not, is a relatively captivating story. We have a kingdom in Saudi Arabia. The Al Saud family, named the country after themselves, Saudi Arabia. And the family has really three main divisions. There's tons of princes in Saudi Arabia, but there's the Abdullah faction, the former king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, who was king prior to King Solomon, was of this branch of the family. His two sons, at least two of his sons, one has been killed and one has been imprisoned by Mohammed bin Salman. One of the other factions of the family, the Naif family, this was the former crown prince, I believe, until about June when he was replaced by the king. The king made his son crown prince, and Naif was, I think, put under pretty much house arrest in his palace that he had, and was stripped of all of his authorities and titles, and I'm sure lost some of his money and stuff like that. The third faction of the family is the Solomon faction. The current king is King Solomon. His son, Mohammed bin Salman, is the person who's really been behind this consolidation of power by the Solomon portion of the family. He's now the defense minister, the crown prince, and holds several other important titles and authorities in Saudi Arabia. He has put people and friends of his in positions of power. He imprisoned the sixth richest man in the world, and the richest man is Saudi Arabian. And he has also placed under house arrest the president of Yemen, really only South Yemen, Hadi, and for a brief period of time, the prime minister of Lebanon, who was also a Saudi civilian, as well as a Lebanon citizen, and that is Saad Hariri, prime minister of Lebanon. Now, Hariri was allowed to go to France, but his three youngest children had to remain in Saudi Arabia. So if anybody's trying to say, look, it looks like the Saudis aren't really controlling him and he's not a sock puppet, well, his three youngest children are pretty good collateral. This may also be a good time to chime in if somebody's talking about, Game of Thrones, be like, there's some real life Game of Thrones going on with Saudi Arabia. So that's kind of the status of that. Saudi Arabia is trying to, hold a lot of influence and sway in the Middle East. We'll see how bin Salman's consolidation of power goes moving forward. Unfortunately, the mainstream media has portrayed this guy as some kind of reformer. He had made a plan to allow women to drive, I believe in the summer of 2018. I don't know if women are actually licensed to drive right now in Saudi Arabia or not, but they always like to talk up that while completely ignoring the genocide going on in Yemen, which, like I said, he's kind of the guy who orchestrated that and put that all into motion. The other two places where there's, a lot of U.S. bombing going on right now is Somalia. While Al-Shabaab is linked to Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab is much more of a regional group than, a group with global ambitions. Unlike Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab doesn't necessarily plot attacks against the West. Also, the United States is carrying out a lot of attacks against Al-Shabaab and has killed an awful lot of Somali civilians in those attacks. The United States, I believe, has doubled about the amount of airstrikes they carried out this year compared to last year in Somalia. The other place is Libya, and if Libya comes up, there's so much going on there, but the country's an absolute failed state. That's what I would focus on, is that there's a government in the east, there's a government in the west, there's these individual little cities that exist in the south, and this is all because of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. I think half of women or 2/3 of women and children who make it as refugees report rape or sexual abuse. About half of those reports say that the rape or abuse occurred from a soldier in uniform. Men are being raped as a method of war right now in Libya. What's going on is, in order to shame people from never entering battle again, they will rape them or sodomize them with some kind of object. There's also open slave trade going on right now in Yemen. Many refugees who are coming in are actually just being sold to be slaves. I say Yemen, I meant Libya. Anyways, so that's kind of the Turkey Day guide. A lot of depressing stuff, but, if these topics come up, be able to talk about them. That way maybe we could convince some people, rally some support. As hard as it is to talk about something like the situation in Yemen, where hundreds of thousands of children are starving to death over a meal that, glorifies gluttony in the United States. It's the most important issue. As much as it's, difficult and unpleasant to talk about those kind of things, if the United States stops supporting Saudi's war in Yemen, it's going to make all the difference for Yemeni babies who, may otherwise starve to death or die of cholera. All right, so if you want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. The Facebook page is the Libertarian Union, or it could be found at the libertarianinstitute.org. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. I do a daily news roundup. For those of you who are, everyday listeners to the show, I do plan on putting out a show on Friday, but there's probably not going to be another news roundup out till Monday, so I hope everybody enjoys, the Thanksgiving weekend and, has a good time, eats plenty of turkey, and taught some foreign policy to some relatives.